very much on the Danmei. When you get into the detail of certain authors, Yao is very very expert on that. So maybe I could just summarize. We've been doing the online. You're correct. It's mostly online survey. But we have done some of the surveys being handed out face to face, particularly in China. So we have a survey that's in English and almost identical survey in Chinese. And they've been online since about 2014, and they're both still open. So we're still collecting data, and we're almost at we're still collecting data. And we'd really love people to, if they're a Danmei or a Yaoi fan, if they're interested to fill in the survey. So we're up to almost about 2,000 people filled in each of them. So that's a data set of 4,000, which is really big. It's the biggest in this field. So generally, also Yao did some interviews. She did 20 interviews with Chinese fans. They were all women. We didn't exclude men, but men didn't put themselves forward for the interviews, and that was part of her PhD. So we've been doing a lot of analysis of that material, and just to maybe summarize, maybe if I just summarize some of the main cultural differences, and then if you've got specific questions, I'm very happy to go into a little bit more detail. And Yao, do add to this if I've missed any of the main points. But okay, but one of the main things is that the Chinese Danmei is the stories and the characters, the stories and the male characters are presented in a way that would be very usual for romances between men and women to be presented. So it's almost, a lot of the stories, not all of them, but a lot of them are very much like a romantic story between a man and a woman, except the characters are two men, and that the context in which the men are having this relationship is again kind of set in what we might call a kind of a heteronormative kind of context, where having family approval for the relationship and having maybe some kind of social recognition, like a marriage. We looked at Harry Potter fan fiction, and there was always a marriage between the male characters in Harry Potter. Having children was important, particularly boy children. Whereas in the Anglophone community, it's that the stories are, I suppose, what you might call that they're more queer. So the sense that it is a relationship, and often a sexual relationship between men, is indicated by those relationships not always fitting what you'd expect of a male-female relationship. And that the community who engage with Yaoi in the West are broader in their sexual identifications and their gender identifications, and there's more men who engage with Yaoi and BL in the West. So though, have I missed any key points, Yao, that you want to?
No, I think you cover everything. The most thing.
Yeah. In terms of commonalities, just because that's quite a big difference, to have quite a heteronormative stories in Chinese Danmei and much more queer kind of context in the Anglophone. But where the similarities are is that Yao and I looked at what you might call the more risky sexual content of BL, and this risky content would kind of fits the criteria of kind of paraphilic content, things like human animal sexuality, though of course within within yaoi, often it's hardly ever a real animal. It's kind of a humanoid, a humanoid with animal features. But when we looked at that, we found that that it was very, very similar. So where it was very similar across the Chinese content and what the Chinese engage with, and with the Anglophone content and the Anglophone community, the more risky content is very similar. The taste is very, very similar, with some subtle cultural differences. But maybe we also found that it's because the avid fans, so those people who engage with BL a lot, who really like it, the main question asked by researchers has been this question about why do people engage with, why does with yaoi, why has it got a large global fan base, and particularly a female fan base, and our work shows that that's correct. It is a largely female fan base, not totally, but yes, it is. That's been the most kind of question that researchers have really kind of asked again and again and again, and there's a range of kind of answers to that, and the main answer that comes up is yes, it is the sexual content, that the romantic content is a big draw as well, but a lot of people do like it to have some sexual content, at least some kind of erotic charge in it, even if that's not kind of what you might call full-blown kind of pornographic. The kind of the sexual charge between the male characters, I think, is something that the readership really look for. But I also want to say that with my reading of BL, because I'm not, I don't speak any or read any language other than English, I would need to comment more on the Chinese. But it's not usually pornography like you would get if you went onto Pornhub or something.
Oh, yes.
It can be really it's sexually explicit, but I think to me one of the key aspects of BL is that the sexuality is not always, but very often set within a romantic context. And that's not, in my kind of understanding of kind of normal pornography, that's not usually the case. It is sometimes, I mean, pornography is, it's very complex and it's a huge area, but it's something which really I notice with BL is that it's almost like with BL, you get a romantic story, which then follows the characters into the bedroom. And that's kind of a mixing of genres, whereas if you're interested in romance, you normally stop at the bedroom door. But yeah, we just go, you go straight in with them. So it some of it's just really kinky pornography, but there's usually a sense that these are people who are enjoying a sexual relationship. So I think that for me, that's something I think is really important about BL, that might be why it attracts women, is written by women and attracts women. It's not to take away from the sexuality, because it's powerful and that's really important, and there's nothing wrong with that. And then the last point I want to make is that because it's romance and sexuality between men, you kind of in a way take gender out of it, because there you have two people who are relating romantically engaged and sexually engaged. So the kind of cultural power differences that play out between men and women in these situations just doesn't. So even if the characters are playing a kind of more feminine and a more masculine role, they're still men. So that that power difference, which often I think women do feel when they are engaging in romantic and sexual relationships or engaging in pornography on the internet, I find it very difficult to take away that sense of just being a little bit on the back foot as a woman. Whereas when I see two men in a story, they're equals in a way that I can kind of put myself into it a little bit and feel like, hey, that's what a a romantic and sexual relationship might kind of look like and feel like if the gender kind of power differences were taken out of it. And personally, I find that very attractive, and I think a lot of women say that they equally find that attractive.
Okay.
A survey does ask about the way in which people engage with yaoi, and online, people really want to engage online. I can speak about, I mean, my Yao really, has educated me about Danmei, and it's virtually all. You talk about Danmei, about it being almost completely online. In the West, it's a really interesting phenomenon just in terms of women's writing, as well as it being a particular kind of writing. The internet has really opened up, I think, for women's creativity, that women can self-publish, they can, fit it in between all the other work they have to do, they can maybe earn a little bit of money, or it's their hobby, and they can do it, they can, write for other women, rather than kind of have they can express themselves. So I think the internet has done has created a really interesting space for women writers to flourish, first of all. And a lot of yaoi is fan fiction, so it takes characters who are already in public, in public popular culture. I mean, just kind of thinking, things like Starsky and Hutch, or of course Kirk and Spock, who were the first kind of slash couple. So what women did was they got really into certain television programs and comic books or something, and then their kind of erotic imagination was kind of triggered by this, and then they wrote their stories, and they self-published in just fanzines. Then the internet came, and they published online, and they got kind of supported by other fans. So there's that kind of like huge fan fiction where women and men, but I think mostly women are writing about popular cultural figures, and they're eroticizing that. And then there's stories where authors are writing not kind of their own characters, so there is that strand as well. But I think it's fair to say that most online is probably fan fiction, but it's absolutely massive. But unfortunately, it also is quite derided online. So you imagine that the fandom, let's take the Harry Potter fandom, the fans who are writing kind of yaoi Harry Potter fan fiction. So they're taking two male characters and they're putting them in an erotic relationship. It's fair to say that they're not really particularly liked by the main fandom, because it kind of takes you. If you're not into it, it's not very nice to think about your favorite characters being portrayed in that way, and if they're young characters as well, like Harry and Draco, you don't, I can really understand that as a Harry Potter fan, you don't really want to think about people doing that with your favorite characters. So I've kind of forgotten your question now. Danmei, and there's a lot of it online, and a lot of them just kind of dip into it. So that was one thing, given the censorship, it was quite a surprise to me. It wasn't a surprise to Yao, but it was quite a surprise to me that it's just really well known in that youth kind of bracket, and dipped into, but just kind of dipped into and then not really engaged with, and then young people kind of move on. So a big cultural difference is in the West. It's much more of a niche interest, so that not so many young people know about BL, or dip into it. So it tends to be a kind of subculture. Really, I mean, it's big because it's just this lot of it on the internet, but it's also the English speaking world, you know, like China, it's a lot of people. So it's seen as, it is kind of more subcultural than it is in China, which might be kind of like counterintuitive. So there's not the mass engagement with BL like there is in China, and it's seen more as a kind of niche taste. So that might be a kind of a barrier. And the other thing is there is a lot of women writing male kind of erotica. In both China and in the West, and I think as Yao's pointed out, the danmei it'll appeal to the romantic taste, but it might be that in the West there's more of a taste for the more sexual content. So, but so it's interesting. It'll probably, you know, it will find an audience, I'm sure, but the audience in the West might have more of a taste, a niche taste, and more of a taste for kind of the slightly harder hitting. And then just to build on what Yao said, is that the sexual content, there are some taboos in the West that are just not quite such taboos in the East, and you know, and vice versa. And one of them that Yao pointed out to is the kind of the eroticization of non-human beings. So whether they're mythological creatures or creatures who morph into animals or have animal features, kind of an erotic relationship between humans and these creatures is very kind of is much more kind of just acceptable in Eastern culture. It's just it's not a barrier. Whereas you do get it in the West, and we certainly have a lot of fairy tales and we have a lot of mythologies, but the sexualization of that is actually quite difficult for Westerners, and Westerners don't have quite kind of that, don't seem to have that. Yao and I wondered whether there might be it might be a little bit to do with Christianity, although of course the West is not is quite secular, but there is definitely a difference made between animal and human. Can I add to that I think one reason that Yaoi is tends to be more of a niche interest in the West is because it does tend to have quite a lot of sexual content in it, and you need to like the sexual content, whereas for a lot of people, to be fair, you know, the vast majority of people, it's really, really off-putting because if it's not your thing, it's really, you're not going to, even if you like fantasy, it's got a great story, you're just going to hate it, because then you don't want to follow the characters into the bedroom. It spoils it. So I think I wanted just to build on what Yao said about if danmei the kind of forefront the fantasy, and can pull in the fantasy audience, which is massive, and just hint at the closeness of the relationship between the men. It's a fine line, but you can play that fine line not to put off the kind of usual readership, and particularly with fantasy, there's a large male readership, a large male heterosexual readership, who are really not going to, my understanding of it is they're really not going to engage. Not many of them are going to engage with they're going to be really put off if the main characters start to have a romance. But what's happened in mainstream culture is that these yaoi elements have infiltrated the mainstream. So I think Yao tells me that in China that's really quite strong, but we can also see in the West that certain very mainstream, very popular programs like Sherlock is a really good example. Yeah. So Sherlock's got a really big general. Can I just build on that? Is it's really important, I think, to differentiate between what's created and just put on the internet, and what is then packaged for the market, what becomes, you know, kind of packaged by a business for the normative market. So the internet kind of the internet is just like massive, and in many ways, regulated, but very difficult to regulate. Whereas with a publishing house, it's a completely different kind of situation. So a publishing house will need to obviously be sure that if they're dealing with erotic material, that they are that it's legal in the jurisdictions that they're selling it in, because it's just like obviously really, really basic. And yaoi can push a lot of these legal boundaries. And so it has to be selected what is actually produced for the business market. Obviously, just needs to be very selective about and very safe about what's actually packaged and marketed. So the laws are, even across the, I'm not an expert, but even across the states, the laws in different states will be a little bit different about what's legal, what's not, but also whether it's in words or if it's in images, and what kinds of images. So yaoi does kind of, for a publisher to take that on, they need to play really, really, really safe with what's selected. And I think in terms of things like father-son erotica, if it's in images, I mean, images are just really, a lot of yaoi is in images. Of course, the Japanese manga is in images. Images are so risky. The laws around images, even drawn images, are it's really, really difficult in the area of yaoi, because many of the characters can look underage, even if they're presented as, sometimes they're even presented as very young. But what is underage is different across the globe. so that's in the global community, that's really, really tricky. But where erotica and pornography are in narrative form, there are obviously prescriptions around that in law, but it tends to be not as tricky as if you're actually presenting images. And most of danmei is in narrative form, so it does make that just a little less complicated. But I'm not sure about a story between like a father and a son. If the son is an adult, it's probably not pushing legal boundaries in most places, but I'm not a legal expert. But if the character is narratively underage, it is. Or that that if a genre is considered to be a woman's genre or a female genre, that unfortunately it's downgraded. So romance, because it's seen as a woman's genre, is seen as less serious than, let's say, science fiction, which is maybe seen as a more male genre, but of more general interest. But romance is a very denigrated genre anyway, and when you have romance which is written by women for women, which has male erotica in it, it is very denigrated. It's seen as, I mean, it tends to be fan fiction, and again, fan fiction is denigrated, seen as poor writing, as amateur, and tends to be women writing it, which then is is denigrated purely for that reason. Fan fiction is seen as not, that you are piggybacking on other people's ideas. So it's not that kind of you're using characters which somebody else has written. So again, it's denigrated for that. Whereas they can be well written and really novel stories and really interesting and really well done, but it's difficult because it's denigrated, and there's a lot of taboo about sexualizing much loved characters. So yeah, I mean, if something can be promoted as science, not a thing really, it's kind of they're just kind of like, why would any of this be an issue really? So I think just kind of being the openness, the culture is very different with young people. But I also want to just kind of build on what Yao said about male. There is a tiny beginning of male erotic actual literature with written by women, which does have kudos, which has cultural currency. And I'm thinking the book and the film that came out quite a little time ago, Brokeback Mountain, for instance. So Brokeback Mountain is written by I'd have to just look up her name, but she's a very well-known, very respected writer, very good writer, who then wrote this. It's quite a small book, and a very good book, and then a film which was incredibly popular, and also had was seen as an excellent, kind of reviewed very well. And there is Japanese manga from the 1970s, which it was the very beginning of kind of boys' love, kind of shonen ai manga, which has the status of a cultural treasure. It's the the Song of the Wind and Trees, and the Heart of Thomas. These very early manga from the 1970s, which showed kind of male romance, are literature. Kind of they are the highest kind of publications in manga, and give an award. Have had many different awards. So I think there is the chance that male romance by and for women can reach the height, can be deemed to be literature if it's written well. It doesn't have to be seen as low literature.